Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to Canada, and more specifically the Niagara Peninsula in Ontario. And we're looking at the Therianthropy Wines 2020, the Negotiant Cabernet Franc. Therianthropy Wines is the brainchild of David Eiberg and his wife Anastatia Phillips, who launched the project in 2018. David was born in Zimbabwe, and he had a previous life as an investment banker before getting into wine. He began his winemaking journey around 8 years ago. He studied winemaking at UC Davis and did harvests in Burgundy, Oregon, California, Canada, and South Africa before eventually settling in Ontario. Therianthropy Wines works with select growers and vineyards, primarily in the Niagara Peninsula in Ontario, with a focus on organic viticulture and using fruit from single vineyard sources and low intervention winemaking techniques, with the goal of making wines that are the purest possible expression of place. They're primarily working with the grape varieties that excel in Ontario, namely Riesling and Chardonnay for the whites, and Cabernet Franc and Gamay for the reds. The term therianthropy loosely translates to the mythological process of shapeshifting, and this term has a couple meanings for the brand. First, the shape-shifting between humans and animals, which is represented on the label, and the shape-shifting of grapes into wine through the process of fermentation. Each of the grape varieties that Therianthropy works with is represented by a particular character that is part animal, part human, each with their own distinct personality. And these characters are lovingly brought to life on the labels by famed French artist Michel Thomer. And the artwork for these wines will change with each wine and each vintage. Now, David is a huge Cabernet Franc fan, and he really does believe in this grape's place as a leading variety in Ontario. And appropriately, Cabernet Franc in the Therianthropy family is represented by the Negotiant, who David describes as the superhero of the lineup. David makes 2 Cabernet Francs each vintage, one being the more fun, playful side of Cabernet Franc, which is the wine Le Maillot, which is essentially the Negotiant on vacation. Maillot in French means bathing suit, and this is very much a crushable, chillable, glou-glou style of Cabernet Franc. And then we have the serious side of Cabernet Franc, which is the Negotiant, which is of course the wine that we're looking at today. So for the 2020 vintage, this is coming from a 1-acre parcel of Cabernet Franc vines planted in the Redfood Vineyard, and this is in the Lincoln Lakeshore VQA subappellation. So this appellation will be the focus of our terroir deep dive today. Now, of all the subappellations in the Niagara Peninsula, because of its sheer size, the Lincoln Lakeshore appellation is really probably one of the most difficult to summarize in terms of its climate and soils, because there's a lot of variability across this large area. So the appellation stretches about 25 kilometers from east to west along the Lake Iroquois Plain, following Lake Ontario, the shoreline of Lake Ontario to the north, and then the Lake Iroquois shore bluff to the south. Now, to put this distance into perspective, the Niagara-on-the-Lake regional appellation is less than 12 kilometers wide, and it is divided into 4 sub-appellations. So naturally, there will be quite a bit of nuance across the appellation, but in terms of the climate across the Lincoln Lakeshore, generally speaking, we are getting cooler as we move west across the appellation. Now, what's also important to note is that the Lincoln Lakeshore appellation also narrows considerably as we move west as well. So in the eastern part of the appellation, at its widest point, we're about 4.5 kilometers or so from north to south. And then it narrows to about 1.5 to 2.5 kilometers in the western part of the appellation. And this is around the towns of Grimsby and Winona. Now, as is the case across the Niagara Peninsula, the Lake Ontario is an important regulator of climate for the Lincoln Lakeshore appellation. So in the parts of the appellation that are closest or closer to Lake Ontario, these areas will receive the strongest breezes off the lake, and this will cool conditions considerably. Conversely, in the parts of the appellation that are wider, with vineyards that are set further away from the lake, these vineyards will be a little bit on the warmer side. Now, in general, because of how close the Lincoln Lakeshore is to Lake Ontario, the growing season will be, while a bit cooler, it will actually be a little bit longer than some vineyards that are located further inland. In terms of topography, to the naked eye, this appellation appears flat, but it is on a gradual, very gentle north-facing slope towards Ontario, with elevations ranging from around 80 meters above sea level, closest to the shoreline of Lake Ontario, rising to about 90 meters above sea level in the southern part of the appellation. Because of this relatively flat topography, the vineyards enjoy uninterrupted sunshine during the growing season, and this, of course, is very good for ripening. Now, in terms of soils, across this large area, of course, there will be some variability, but we can make some generalizations here. So approximately 55% of the appellation has a very deep sandy topsoil. This is predominantly in the western part of the Lincoln Lakeshore appellation. And this deep sandy topsoil is then followed by either a clay loam or a sandy loam subsoil, depending on where you are. And then in some localized pockets, we find a heavier clay, either a red clay or a gray clay, depending on where you are. And then in terms of the bedrock, which is well below the surface, the bedrock here is the Queenston Formation red shale. Now, looking a little bit more specifically at the Redfood Vineyard, this vineyard is about 25 hectares, and there's a number of grape varieties planted here. And the vineyard is located in a pretty central part of the Lincoln Lakeshore appellation. So we're about halfway in between the villages of Vineland, which is to the east, and Beamsville, which is to the west. And the vineyard is actually set a little bit further away from Lake Ontario. We're about 3.5 to 4 kilometers south of the shoreline of Lake Ontario, which will make this site a little bit warmer, which is good for red grape varieties like Cabernet Franc. And then in terms of soils, the soils here, we are in a part of the appellation where we find those heavier clays. And specifically here, we're dealing with an iron-rich red clay. And then in terms of the Cabernet Franc vines planted here, there's actually about 2.5 hectares. It's about 6 acres of Cabernet Franc vines planted here, 1 acre of which is for this wine. And then the vines would have been planted in the early 2000s. So in 2020, the vines would have been around 18 or so years of age. Now, from a winemaking perspective, it's important to note that David does not have a particular formula with regards to the Negotiant. He really does let the vintage kind of dictate how he approaches this wine in the cellar in terms of how ripe the fruit is and also the condition of the fruit at harvest. So for the 2020 vintage, this was a terrific vintage for Cabernet Franc in the Niagara Peninsula. So this was all hand harvested fruit. It was hand sorted, and David actually opted to do 75% of the fruit whole cluster and 25% destemmed. The fermentation vessel of choice here was concrete egg, and the fruit underwent a cold soak for about 6 days before alcoholic fermentation kicked off. Fermentation is with indigenous yeast, and then the cuvaison, as the French would say, is around 20 days. So that's the fermentation and the post-fermentation maceration time combined is about 20 days. During this time, they would have done some pump overs and punch downs to ensure a healthy fermentation as well as to aid extraction. And then the aging also took place in concrete egg for about 7 months before the wine is bottled. And the bottling is done unfined, unfiltered, with low to no SO2, depending on how the winemaking kind of all went down. So let's get into this wine. So in terms of the fruit profile, it's very bright, a bit high-toned as well. It kind of hits up here, if you will. And I'm getting a nice mix of red and some darker fruits here. There's a bit of red raspberry. There's a touch of ribena, which for those that don't know what that is, it's a blackberry, or excuse me, a black currant juice, which is very common in Canada as well as the UK as well. There's also a little bit of a wild strawberry note, which I quite like. And then in terms of the pyrazines and that herbaceous profile in the wine, I would say that the fruit and the pyrazines are kind of on equal footing here. The wine does lean a little bit more on the earthier side. I'm getting a certain leafiness. There's like a cedar leaf note. There's also a little bit of a capsicum chili pepper thing going on as well. There's a touch of a picholine olive note as well on the nose, which is quite nice. Yeah, and in general, it's got a nice floral tone as well, like a bit more like rose petals for me in terms of the florals, but really pretty on the nose. On the palate, those same fruits come through pretty much bang on as they did on the nose. There's a little bit more of a wonderful pomegranate juice, like maybe even like a palm blueberry juice kind of thing going on the palate, which is kind of nice. The palate is also quite spicy, which I really like. There's a bit of cinnamon here. There's a little bit of a pink peppercorn note. There's also, again, that kind of chili pepper thing that's happening as well. Yeah. So the acidity, really snappy, crunchy, juicy acidity, very lively. Tannins, there's a nice supple mouthfeel, a nice silkiness on the sort of in the middle palate. They finish with a crushed velvet texture with a little bit of a chewiness to the tannin as well, which is nice because that's providing a really nice counterpoint to that juicier, more buoyant fruit profile as well. The wine has medium weight, I would say. Very nice balance as well. And I do like the fruit profile on the palate in terms of that dance between the earthy, savory undertones and the fruitier, juicier, crunchy fruit undertones as well. I think those are playing really nicely off of each other. In general, this wine has this very Moorish quality. The French use the term buvabilité, which is essentially drinkability, but I love the term buvabilité more because it's just awesome. But this very much has that. It has the friendly character to it, but there's also a slight side. There's a little bit of seriousness here, but it's like, it's serious, but it doesn't want to be taken too seriously. But I like how it's kind of doing a little bit of a dance between those two things in terms of the overall profile of the wine. Yeah, in general, this wine is really lovely. It's playful, it's fun, but there's also a serious edge to it. And you know, I've had a few of David's Cabernet Francs, and really, I think he does a great job with Cabernet Franc. And his Cabernet Francs always seem to have this Loire sensibility to them. And I know that that's really where David's heart lies in terms of the Cabernet Francs that he really loves. And this is the sort of wine that I would love to throw blind into a lineup with some Chinon and Bourgueil, because I think that this would hold its own pretty well in that lineup. It's really lovely. And it's a bit of a departure from a lot of the Cabernet Francs that I tend to see and taste from Niagara, which often tend to have a little bit longer élevage, more wood as well, leaning a bit more in that Bordeaux style. But that's what's amazing about Niagara Cabernet Franc is you can get a little bit of everything depending on the vintage, depending on the fruit source and the approach to winemaking. You can have a little bit of Loire, a little bit of Bordeaux, and it's just so distinctively Niagara. And also, I should note, is I've had Cabernet Franc from this Redfood Vineyard a few times previously from Taz as well as Pearl Morissette. And I do think I like this site. It's got a very distinct character, and I think it's a great place for Cabernet Franc. And the Cabernet Franc vines, from what I can tell, seem pretty happy here. If you have had a Cabernet Franc from Therianthropy, do let me know what you had in the comments below. If you haven't had these wines, do seek them out if you're in Ontario. Unfortunately, I doubt that they're doing much by way of export, but if you're visiting Ontario, these are definitely some Cabernet Francs to be keeping on your radar for sure. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.